Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Current Yield. This is Grant's Interest Rate Observer of the Air, and I am Jim Grant with you, and with me, as always, Eric Whitehead, who is sitting to my left. He's just rather informally today, is Eric. We're going to the Mets game, after this podcast. That's the truth of it.
Weather permitting.
We don't care if it's raining.
We're going to go, at least.
Correct. And the great Evan Lorenz, who is the deputy editor of Grant's, is sitting across from me, and Phil Grant, from whom you have already heard. He's the Mets fan. He's sitting to my right. And on the long-distance telephone from as far away as Finland, mind you, not Finland, Pennsylvania. We're talking about Finland as Tuomas Malinen, who we think is the clearest voice of reason in economics from the entire European continent. Yeah, that's the consensus here at Grant. So, Thomas, besides being the clearest voice in economics in Europe, you're also the CEO of GNS Economics Limited, an adjunct professor of economics at the University of Helsinki, and vice chairman of Euro Think Tank. So, with all of that, we welcome you.
Thank you. We Finns are quite modest people, so that there is a lot of. I always consider that to be an overstatement, but thank you. I'll try to be the voice of reason, for sure.
Yeah. Well, don't mind me. I'm an American. We always talk big. So when some of us also back it up, but not many of us.
No.
It's just a national trait.
No.
But ladies and gentlemen, Tuomas Malinen is here, first of all, because he's kind enough to make some time for us. And secondly, because we at Grants were minding our own business, reading Twitter. We should have been reading something more substantial, perhaps, except on this Twitter thread is the clearest expression of enlightened doubt concerning the doctrines and protocols of modern economic, specifically macroeconomic thought by our guest on the phone, Tuomas Malinen. And I'm going to read you a few excerpts, and maybe you can join in our excitement at this wonderfully clear strain of thought. All right, so here goes. I'm now quoting our guest, Tuomas Malinen. Economics, more precisely macroeconomics, is in serious need of an overhaul. It's possible that we, classically trained macroeconomists, have been wrong for decades, but in the history of science, that's nothing new. That was what struck me so much. It was the statement of scientific integrity. For example, ladies and gentlemen, there's one of the founders of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Name will come to me maybe about 45 minutes. But he wrote something called The Principles and Practices of Medicine. The first edition was published like 1890-something. And this is one of the great textbooks of turn-of-the-century medicine. And he did this author, William Osler, Dr. Osler, in his textbook, urged his fellow doctors to practice bleeding. And that was state of the art around 1890-something. And the latest edition of that work, published, I think, in 1940s, still recommended bleeding of patients for treatment. So, Thomas, is it possible that macroeconomics, without quite realizing it, is caught in the same sort of intellectual dead end?
For sure. Compared to medicine, which in its history has a kind of it has been wrong many times. I don't think economics really, or macroeconomics, has not really been this wrong ever before. And that's kind of a problem. It's really difficult for majority of us macroeconomists to admit to that, to say that we were wrong. The models we build are wrong, and so this is I think that makes this an even bigger issue than in medicine, where they have kind of used to being wrong and correcting
yes.
their recommendations and hypotheses and such.
Yes, Phil's mother and my wife, Patricia Cavanaugh, is a physician, and she relates the story of how the first day at medical school, one of the professors says, everything you learn here is going to be proven wrong. And the problem is we don't know which half. Evan, you had a question for Target.
Yeah, that's true. But that's like you said, that's the scientific integrity, basically. So and well, macro, like economics in general, it's not science like medicine in a sense. It's like we are more in a kind of a humanities, sociology and stuff like that.
With a fair bit of physics envy in there thrown in as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, but the thing is, that it's what I'm kind of getting here is that we have had many schools of thought in the past, and for some reason, which I don't actually know, I'm not probably old enough, the kind of the standard neoclassical Keynesian school won the battle, and now we just have to think that or rethink the thing that maybe the other schools, like the Austrian school, had probably gotten certain things like the growth and the business cycle theories more right than the one we are following now.
Thomas, it strikes me that the practical expression of this crisis in macroeconomics, which you diagnose so well, perhaps is the central bank's preoccupation, indeed obsession, with low. I was going to suggest that maybe the practical expression of this crisis in macroeconomics is in the central banks and their obsession with ever lower interest rates down through zero into deeper and deeper negative regions.
Yeah, for sure. And the funny thing is that we already knew from the Japanese example in the 1990s that cutting rates to very low or negative doesn't actually work as intended. Something else happens. The economy kind of zombifies. And all the academic research that I could find were basically published between 2005 and 2010, maybe. So we already had the knowledge that the zero interest rates, QE, they don't work as intended. So we have the information when Ben Bernanke and others started these experiments. So we knew it, but they still tried. I don't know did they read the research or not, but still they went with it. And there lies another problem, which very much undiscussed in economics and in more generally, is that central banks are the biggest employer of macroeconomists, biggest single employer of macroeconomists in the world. They dominate the kind of the intake of PhD macroeconomists. They also dominate the thinking. So this I don't know how relevant or how big of a problem is this, but it surely has dampened the criticism towards central bank over the years.
Thomas, there was a great study by the U.S. Congressional Budget Office that came out earlier this week that really reinforces that. What they did is they looked at the forecast of inflation from economists and also from just the general public. And what they found out that was since central banks have adopted inflation targets, economists have done much worse than the general public. And the reason being is that economists anchor themselves to the central bank's inflation target, whereas the public kind of looks at what they're spending money on. Yeah. How widespread is the sense that there's something wrong in economics when you talk to other PhDs? Is this something that people talk about like at bars, like after work, or is there a general sense of something is wrong?
I have become kind of an outcast on our profession.
Well done, Thomas.
During the last year or so, but there are the younger people like me and even younger, the PhD students. There are certain people who are doubting this, and also some professors. But we are few at the moment. And what really scares me is that not even at the bar discussions do the criticism still lacks. It goes more on the defense. Why do you say this? Why do you criticize the central banks and stuff like that? And the people I know, of course, are a bit shocked because I was very much trained as a classical economist. I very much believed on the power of the central banks and stuff like that. When we did the analysis on the global economy and started to really think about these things outside our academic work, we quickly realized that this is not going to work properly. And it was so clear, like even 2-3 years ago when there was no inflation and growth was anemic across the globe and rates were zero and QEs were running, that the whole model doesn't work. It doesn't work. There are the fundamental assumptions about the idea, the assumption that the real economic growth or the growth fundamentals are not connected with the central bank policy. This has been one of the biggest things that we have got wrong. So we assume that the interest rates do not affect the growth prospect, but they do. That's what the Japanese example shows. Yeah. And this changes the whole game. If central bank meddling actually hinders the growth prospect of a real economy, then you need to rethink the whole thing, starting from how much do you cut, at what place do you raise or cut interest rates, and even should central banks set the interest rates at all.
Right. So, Thomas, one of the big questions is, did interest rates fall or were they pushed? That is to say, are today's interest rates the pure function of a market-determined price, or are they the fruit of 10 years of almost nonstop central bank intervention? And if the latter, where do we go? So at Grants, our belief is that these lower rates beget lower rates, and radical monetary policy begets even more radical monetary policy. But we are not sure where it all ends up. Where do you think this cycle ends up?
We think that there are only two offers: is that the central bankers realize their mistake or are politically bind to not to cut anymore, and the reset comes, and then rates rise, and we have banking crisis and collapse and stuff like that. Or then they really try to push them all the way they can go, really low, really push them, and when it's really difficult to say how low can they go before the system breaks up. Now they are like just before you called, I know this is a story. It was in Bloomberg, I think, about 3 big European banks arguing, basically pleading that do not cut the rates anymore, because the profits are gone. So there will be a definite lower bound for the interest rates, after which the banking sector implodes and we have the crisis. But the question is that your listeners and we also think about is that will central bank try to push the rate to that limit? And we cannot answer that. We can only hope that they don't. If they don't, then the interest rate will correct upwards as soon as we have the depression, I think. But the other option is that they'll really try to push the rates down all the way and implode the whole system.
Tuomas, I noticed that there's a challenge in the German Constitutional Court against the legality of the ECB's asset purchases program. Is that something that could yield at least a curtailment of QE in Europe, or a push to still more negative rates, or do you think that will not end up being a factor?
I'm rather certain it will play a role, because even if it accepts the current, even if the court accepts the current QE program, I don't think it will accept many more. So it might. We don't know how they decide, but they might put a strict limit for the ECB to buy. And if the ECB goes beyond that point, they can order the Bundesbank to stop participating on the program.
Yeah. You know what the central banks might think of, Tuomas, is hiring a new kind of person rather than these economists. And to do that, they might well check in with our friends at ZipRecruiter. Perhaps if you are in the business of hiring people and had trouble doing so. I mean, this is it's one of the features of our financial lives. The labor market is tight. So how do you find qualified candidates? Usually it takes a long time. Too many applicants, too many false positives. And this is where ZipRecruiter makes it easy. ZipRecruiter.com/grant will deliver you to the site that will tell you about how you can hire better. So ZipRecruiter sends your job to over 100 of the web's leading job boards, but they don't stop there. With their powerful matching technology, ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes to find people with the right experience and invites them to apply to your job. As applications come in, ZipRecruiter analyzes each one and spotlights the top candidates, so you never miss a great match. ZipRecruiter is so effective that 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day. And right now, our listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at this exclusive web address. And here it is, ZipRecruiter.com/grant. That's ZipRecruiter.com/grant. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire.
Speaking of employment, there was a story that came out in Bloomberg over the weekend that the New York Fed forced out 2 of its senior personnel because the president of the New York Fed, Williams, didn't get along with them or didn't agree with them intellectually. When you talk to PhDs working in central banks, which are the biggest employers of econ PhDs, how open are they to intellectual dissent or to new ideas? Are they really that close-minded?
Actually, the PhDs working at the central banks that I know are the most open-minded persons in private. So this is a strange
Man's
thing.
got to eat, Thomas.
Although the sample is relatively small, but there are many critical voices within the Bank of Finland, for example, which they say in private, in kind of absolute trust environment. But when you go to talk to them in the public media, they say the same thing. In my experience, the most stubborn-head economists currently are in the academia. But of course, in central banks, the guys who run them they are selected there because they are behind the consensus. But the actual PhDs working at the banks are rather critical, at least the people I know.
Tuomas, in the Financial Times last weekend was a signed op-ed essay by a portfolio manager at one of the European asset managers. And interestingly, the employer of the author of this piece has the word prudential in its name. But anyway, the essay said that the central banks ought to give away money to people. Perhaps you saw that. So it's kind of a QE for the masses. And when you think about it, it's not so illogical, right? I mean, the central banks now kind of materialize credit from thin air, in which this credit they buy assets from their friends at the commercial banks, and it's all within the financial system. And so why not give the money directly to the people?
So if you would start giving money to people, where would it stop?
It wouldn't. It would not stop.
And that's the problem. And different version of this has been tried, well, basically as long as there has been modern central bank. And it always goes the same way. You start giving money to the people or the government which spends it, then you have a short burst in economic growth. But then productivity starts to fall or other kind of problems starts to emerge, and finally you lose the trust to the money.
Right.
Well, I think that we've already seen the productivity problem. There's been a number of good studies out recently. One that's linked low interest rates to the growing of oligopolies and monopolies, basically the cartelization of the economy, and eventually lower productivity. And it seems like the data is out there for anybody to work with. It doesn't seem to actually inform central bank decision making.
No, and what could they basically do? I think they might be too far in the rabbit hole to raise their hands up and say we kind of screw this up, because that would probably mean that there would be indictments and stuff like that. But the really positive thing is that the data and the research starts to be there. So after the crisis that is coming is over, we can hopefully build a new system, a new economic model, if you may, to govern our economies in the future. So that's kind of the bright side of it.
Tuomas is.
But central banks are just so deep in it, so I don't see how they can just say that, okay, we quit.
Yeah. Hey, you mentioned the coming crisis. These things do have a way of dragging their feet. They take their time. Do you see signs in Europe of a looming crisis, Tuomas?
Yeah, it is. It's basically, it's all visible in Germany with the industrial production slowing and the hints of Germany falling into recession in the fall. And then there's the Deutsche Bank and the whole banking sector. So we are the kind of the powder keg, if you may, of the global economy at the moment. So when Europe goes, Eurozone goes, our banking sector goes, and all the rest will follow. So that's how we see the situation at the moment.
That's cheery.
Tuomas, how might one invest in view of these signs and portents? Any thoughts on investing?
Yeah, we have actually a lengthy report in our website called The Prepper's Bunker. It's published in June. But basically, I would be very, very invested in Europe. But the problem is that what probably starts here will not stop here. It will spread all over the world because of the overvalued capital markets, basically. So that's how it will go. It will just start from Europe and then spread. So there are not going to be many hiding places left, for sure.
What makes what makes Europe so different from Japan in the sense that zero interest rate policy has been around for 2 decades out there, and it's 5 years old in Europe?
Well, I think there are several things. First is that we have a very diversified cultural background and environment. But there are political risks all over because Japan is just one country. We have many different governments, with different policies, like in Poland, Italy, Greece, even Finland, for that sense. And then with the banking sector is in very dire situation already. So Japan when there was a crisis in Japan in the 1990s, they handled the crisis basically by bailing everyone out and pushing the rates to zero. And in Europe, we had the crisis. We tried to fix the banks. And now when there's another crisis, we cannot use the same remedy again. So you can only administer it once, like they did in Japan. But in Europe, this would be at the second time already. And I don't see how that could work in this current political environment. The thing is that we should, to get everything kind of solved, we would need to build a massive transfer union. Germany, Finland, all the richer countries should just give money to all the banks in Europe. Some wouldn't have to be wound down controllably, but we would need a lot of money. $1 trillion probably do it. And there is not a single country who wants to pay for that. So there is no savior here. The ECB is fully engaged, and the government should come together and try to hold this together. And I don't see that happening. the political cohesion that was used to build the euro is very damaged at the moment, and it's going to the wrong direction, actually.
Is there a good way to bet against the euro if the euro is going to dissolve at some point?
I don't know, gold. Because in the like there is not been, if the euro really fails like we think it might, it's going to be the biggest currency shock ever. So it's really difficult to say how to hedge against it in the current environment. That's for sure. So not much other I can say about that. It's going to be a really difficult situation. So only thing one can do is prepare and keep a watchful eye on the situation, because what's coming, the recession is starting, and the crisis that is coming, it's going to be very exceptional because it's going to be global, and there's going to be no help from the central bank.
Tuomas, given your views on the euro and the fact that you run a business in Europe, in what currency do you bill your customers?
In euro at the moment. We just have to, as long as euro is there, we use euro. And then we use, after it's gone, we use the squirrel skins or whatever. We don't know. We just hope that the European countries are prepared for the possible demise of her, so that we can go back to our national currency. But we really have to see how this plays out. But the risk that the euro is not here in 10 years' time is real, and that has to be acknowledged.
All right. Well, I think this has been a wonderful discussion and a breath of fresh air all the way from Finland. So, Tuomas Malinen, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
It has been, as I say, a delight.
Thank you. It has been an honor.
Yeah, good. Well, we feel the same way. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. And on behalf of Grant's Interest Rate Observer, this is Current Yield, and I'm Jim Grant.